Good. How's your?
Well, welcome, everyone. Hello and hello. Thanks for being here. Isn't it fun to see this room of people?
Yay!
We're here for PTL. It's Pastor-Theologian lunch. Please look at the screen and this beautifully, wonderfully crafted and designed logo. The PTL is hosted by the Girard Chair of Western Theological Seminary, who is Dr. Todd Billings, who's right over there. Some of you, even if you've attended PTL regularly last year, you might not have met Dr. Billings yet because he was on a sabbatical. So we're really glad that he is back. But the purpose of PTL is to bring together deep theological engagement and practical ministry. When we say pastor-theologian, we mean someone who cares about theology as a part of what it means to be on the ground in a life of ministry. So that's what we're about. So we bring in guests who have something interesting to say at that intersection. And today we're really, really excited to have a panel of guests here with us. And I'm going to let President Felix introduce them to you. But what I am going to do first and foremost is pray for us and for our meal. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, thank you for bringing us to this place today. Thank you for the many walks of life that have led us to Western Seminary in some way or another. For some who are guests just for today, and for some who are entering onto their journeys of theological education here. Thank you for the ways that you show your presence to us. Thank you for this food. Thank you for places like Jets who can make good food for us. And would you bless us in this conversation? In your name we pray. Amen.
Well, good to see everybody. Thank you again for being here. I want to express my appreciation for Dr. Todd Billings and Dr. Killen DeVries for allowing us to kind of kick off the PTL season here this fall. We have three guests here with us, and my first question for them actually is for them to share a little more about who they are. But sitting in the middle here is a visiting scholar, Dr. Paul Weston. He get to say a little more about himself. Just be ready for him. He's got a dry sense of humor, so laugh at his British jokes. But Dr. Weston is recently retired from teaching at Ridley Hall and Cambridge University, and he's also the director of the Leslie Newbigin Center there. Sitting to his right is Dr. George Hunsburger, who used to be on faculty here at Western Theological Seminary and also started the Gospel and Culture Network here in the United States. And then sitting on Paul's left is Dr. Esther Theonugraha, my wife. I'm her husband, who also serves as a director of spiritual formation and mission at Faith Reformed Church in Zealand. So I am going to ask them to share just 2 to 3 minutes. Are they able to do that? But Paul, if it's okay, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to George, and we'll go to Esther. Okay.
Okay. 3 minutes. Hi, I'm Paul. I come from here, England, South Coast, a place called Poole, which is great. I live in a tower in a Victorian house. I had a Zoom recently with some American friends, and when I told them that I lived in a tower, they said, "So when's the execution?" Reading too much Wolf. Anyway, I'm Paul. As President Felix said, I've taught at Ridley in Cambridge for 23 years. I did my doctoral work on Leslie Newbigin. I'm an evangelist by calling and gifting, so I'm in my best frame when I'm talking to people who are on the way towards or have questions about faith. I'm ordained in the Church of England, so that could be a good or a bad thing for you. I'm married to Ginny, who's a great deal better looking than I am, and she's also ordained in the Church of England. And we retired 2 years ago. We have 2 children, Mark and Anna, who Felix and Esther know well. And I have 2 grandchildren, and I have a grandchild who's 4, just 2 weeks ago, who's just started school in England, and I'm just trying to get over that. He already had his first French lesson, can you believe? So that's me. I used to be a bit of a mountaineer. That's my pastime. I do have a quirky sense of humor, and I apologize for that, but I think it's God-given. I don't know. So I do have a very dry sense of humor, but it's lovely to be with you this afternoon.
Paul, if it's not God-given, I'm sure God appreciates it.
Some of it, anyway.
I was pleased to be on the faculty here at Western from 1989 to 2014, the end of which I retired. How many of the faculty, the present faculty, are in? Folks? A couple of them came after I retired, but you who were here, when I was here, I want you to know, I voted for all of you. And they're great friends that I appreciate being with. My field here at the seminary was missiology, and that had especially had the impetus of doing doctoral work focused on Leslie Newbigin. I did my dissertation, as did Paul, on his life, on his, especially his theology of cultural plurality. Like many other dissertations on Newbigin, there's a vocal dimension to them. I would say that Paul's recent work, this is beyond your dissertation, right? This book, Humble Confidence, I highly recommend if you want to get the sweep of Newbigin's thinking. It is all woven together extraordinarily well. So he has provided a book that is at the top of the books on Newbigin. My wife and I still live in Holland, miles away. We have 3 children that have respectively added up to giving us 9 grandchildren. The youngest is about the age of your young one, a little bit older. She's in 1st grade this year. And the oldest is a senior at Calvin. The whole full spectrum and all the assorted sports and theatrical events.
Hello, my name is Esther. Married to Felix. You know him. We have 2 kids, Isaiah and Nora. Isaiah is freshman at school, and Nora is at Zealand East. They're great. They're a lot of fun. Let's see. I serve at a church. I have a PhD. Do some work on a foundation. Feel like I'm kind of running in different places and in different circles. I don't know if I've had as much to say. We have known Paul for more than half our lives. We were graduate students like all of you. And he was visiting our school for the semester, and we kind of took him in, maybe like babysitting kind of, in a way. And you know, taught him all of our slang, which is now all unnecessary. So my daughter's trying her best now to teach him. So yeah, so we've known each other for a long time. If any of you are going, I've never heard of Leslie Newbigin, and these people seem to really love Leslie Newbigin, I just want you to know I've never actually really read anything other than a couple quotes by Leslie Newbigin. So don't feel bad about that. Because I only read the things that he writes about it, so now I'll read that book. So anyways, we're so glad you're all here, and I'm hoping that at least, you know, I can contribute a little to this conversation, but I'll mostly give them the mic.
The session, the title for the session is Telling the Story of the Gospel in a Post-Enlightenment Age. I'm going to change up this plan a little bit here, Paul, because I do think it would be helpful for us to just for you to give a little bit of a flavor of about Leslie Newbigin, who he is, and why you chose to study his work, and to just kind of inform us a little bit. That'd be great.
Yeah. I'm a kind of jobbing academic in the sense that I'm not a pure academic. It would drive me bonkers as one of my students, but I'm a kind of practical academic. So I've been involved in apologetic work and evangelistic work in England for getting on for half a century. And there was a time towards the end of the 80s when I was doing outreach events in universities and towns in Great Britain, that I found that my apologetic approach was not having the traction that I felt it used to have. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't kind of scratching where people were itching. And somebody put into my hands a book, I think it was Foolishness of the Greeks of Newton. And I read it, I kind of devoured it, to be honest, because I'd never come across anybody who had taken the situation of Western culture as seriously as he did, and yet was committed to mission, if that makes sense. So he was like, whoa, not at all, for somebody who had a headache. So I then just read everything that I could by Leslie. I think I read most of his stuff. And as Felix has said, ended up doing some research on him. I was privileged enough to meet him and to go and see him. My supervisor at King's London, where I did my PhD, said to me, well, I think we should go and see him. So I looked him up, and we used to have things called phone books, right? And I knew that he spelled his name with a double S and one G, unlike many of his students. So I looked him up, and I knew his wife was called Helen, right? And there it was, Helen and Leslie Newbegin. I can't believe one come with that. So I rang the number without really thinking what I was going to say if somebody answered. And somebody said, Newbegin here. So I said, well, okay, I'm thinking of doing some research that you might be interested in for a PhD. He said, oh yes, what's that? I said, oh dear. So I said, you. Well, that could easily have been the end of the conversation. There was a long pause. And then in this kind of wiry accent, penetrating accent, he said, well, I have been known to have a passing interest in myself. What are you doing tomorrow?
What confidence?
What are you doing tomorrow? So I said, without even thinking about it, nothing. Right. And he said, well, come down and we'll spend the day together. He was that kind of guy. And so I went down, I ended up reading to him because his sight was very bad. Towards the end of his life, he was almost without sight. And I ended up doing some work on a philosopher who Newbegin was very indebted to in many ways, called Michael Polanyi, who wrote a big book called Personal Knowledge. And I found him really not just balm, but I found him to be catalytic in the way in which I thought about mission and evangelism. So I came from quite a conservative, I guess, in terms of apologetic, if it means anything to you, an evidentialist approach to apologetic. You know, I start from the common ground as we perceived it to have been, and then try and work towards the person of Jesus Christ, right? And I found it was like the experience of trying to ride two horses at the same time. Okay, so at some point along that track, you have to transfer from one horse to the other. And I found that transition really, really difficult. But I love the kind of, you know, in and around philosophical discussion and apologetic discussion. I was pretty good at it, I have to say. But I often came from discussions thinking, I never got to talk about Jesus Christ. I never got there. So Newbegin kind of turned my thinking inside out. So Newbegin says, for example, if you think there's a starting point from which you can defend Jesus Christ, you haven't understood the gospel. So the revelation of God in Jesus Christ is its own philosophical terms, a priori. If you don't start there, you're not going to find it easy to get there. All right? And if you put that into a bigger theological frame, if God reveals God's self in human form in the person of Jesus Christ, which is the central witness of the New Testament, that has to be a game changer, right? So you can't build that into some other system, which it may be a lesser or bigger significance in itself. You have to start there, and everything starts there. Once you start there, you then build out from it. So I've termed in the book his approach, a kind of inside-out approach to apologetics. You start with Christ, and that has to do with confession. I believe. Polanyi taught him or helped him to articulate that we really know stuff, and the stuff that we really know is that to which we are personally committed. And so you can't, there's not some kind of intellectual interest. This is a personal commitment. And that was really the starting point of something very different. I can say a lot about that.
Yeah, we'll do, but let's do it. So my question for all three of you is, Newbegin, when he returned from India to Great Britain, discovered that Great Britain has changed quite a bit and described the West as being in a post-Enlightenment age. That's his term. How would you describe the current age that we're in? And how would you approach ministry in this current age?
Should I say, I didn't answer your first question about Newbegin. Newbegin was an Englishman. He was a mission partner in India from 1936 with his wife, Helen. He was very involved in an ecumenical project which became the Church of South India in 1947. And he was a committed ecumenist from the word go. He was not an Anglican. I want to say that very strongly. He was part of the Presbyterian Church. But in the context of the CSI and its formation, he was elected one of the founding bishops of the Church of South India, which is why people think he's Anglican, but he's not. And then, so he spent his life working in India. He was seconded for 6 years to Geneva, to the World Council of Churches, where he wanted and worked towards and succeeded in inculcating the Department of Mission and Evangelism into the life and outlook of the WCC, which is no mean feat, let me tell you. He then went back to India, to Madras, as it was then called, to become Bishop of Madras, and came back, hitchhiking back with Helen in 1974. And he was often asked, what's the thing which strikes you when you got back to England? And he said, it's the disappearance of hope. Now, I think just to be very brief in terms of why it impacted me and what post-enlightenment means, that's a really kind of woke cliche term. But for Newbegin, the context in which he returned to, he felt was blind to its range of faith commitments. It had assumed that secularity was some sort of epistemological Switzerland, right? Where you can just exist, you don't have to be committed to anything. And this neutrality, just seep through educational establishments, seep through universities and so on and so forth. But for Newbegin, he never really called the Western culture secular as such, which I think is really interesting. He called it pagan with a small p. In other words, it's not that they don't worship, but like Paul at Athens, they are worshipping whose were created as worshipping beings. They're worshipping things that are not God. Okay? And just tiny little insight, maybe you come back to it. That has helped me a great deal. Great deal. I think now, I was talking to a dean of one of the Cambridge colleges, so he's a theologian in charge of chapel. I said, what do you find to be the biggest set of questions that your students are asking you when they talk to you? And he said, without hesitation, he said, it's the moribund nature of secularity, right? It doesn't get you anywhere.
Hello.
I'm Natalie. I'm with occupational therapy.
Oh, you are?
Yes.
Mm.
How are you feeling today?
Hold on.
Sorry.
I'll just let, this is a panel discussion.
Gotcha. Do you want me to come back?
Yeah.
Good. I felt that was a voice from outside. Well done, right? Yeah, I mean, wow, word. But
You were getting a little too intense for us there, Paul. We needed some levity.
yeah, exactly. I think I found in my own apologetics, if you start with what is Paul's assumption of Athens, and which was definitely Newbegin's assumption, that you're not talking to somebody who has no commitments in terms of faith. They revolve, actually, in terms that Polanyi describes as fiduciary framework. They exercise faith the whole time. It's just that they don't want to talk about faith. They think faith is what sacred people do, but secular people don't express or exercise faith. And you can help me to see how revolutionary that thought was. So when I'm sharing the good news of Jesus with people, I'm talking between two worshippers, right? And that has opened up things, I think, in a great way, particularly in the present environment where Enlightenment thinking has collapsed. We've gone into post-modernity. We've gone, I don't know where you are, but we're in post brackets, question mark, post-modernity, right? And I think one of the most helpful thinkers there is Charles Taylor. He says, we're in a kind of spiritual supernova, okay? There's a whole range of options. You talk to somebody who claims they're an atheist, and they'll sometimes say, but I do believe in life after death. I've got some stats which my wife sent me, which I might read to you later about, which will tell you what UK is like. So we're dealing in a very different kind of culture, but the way that Newbegin thought through where you start from and where you proceed and how you work with people like that has definitely changed the whole way of the world.
Yeah, that's good. I like your comment toward the end of your comments, Paul. Post-Enlightenment, post. We're in a post age, which is bad news for the cereal industry.
Like it.
But in the midst of that, I mean, one of the things that I also feel deeply is to take some of that discussion of post-enlightenment, post-modernity, post whatever, and the sort of intellectual trends or would-be trendsetters, and some of them do have trend. What does that look like in sort of the people that live in such a context, that are absorbed in it? The whole notion of this network that was developed here at Western through the nineties into the 2000s, called the Gospel and Our Culture Network. The word "our" is important, and that label I lifted directly out of the movement that Newbegin had begun together in the UK, the Gospel and Our Culture. We had as a tagline here in North America, and we had several of us gathering early on, decided we've started a newsletter on some of these themes, our culture and the gospel. How are the interactions between those things going on? And several of us got together for a couple of days, and we decided two things. One, we had inherited that basic project, that agenda from Newbegin and his colleagues in the UK. But also, what we're going to do is work at the American situation. We want it to be our culture just as it is for Newbegin and companions, the culture of the UK, which was theirs. And these are very similar. And so there's a lot we can learn from that, but we wanted to do that work. We also, several of us recognize there are a number of voices in our American society and Canadian society, and it includes both of those. There are a number of voices that have been working in these areas and have contributed a great deal to this conversation, whether they knew about this conversation directly or not. And so we said we wanted to deal with that, but deal with it as missiologists. All four of us in the room were missiologists of several different stripes. One was technically an atheist, but he always saw mission and ethics. What did I say? Ethicist. He saw those two as going together. He was a professor at Weston, where I had done my doctoral work. Well, in the midst of that, that's a daunting, broad cast of an agenda. But in that network of folks, and with the assistance of Western Seminary as kind of the host institution for further developing a newsletter, series of conferences and consultations, several books produced by a collection of scholars in each case, that became the pattern of trying to get the hub of those things. And your topic today, evangelization, in a post-enlightenment world, which is broad and has been around for a while now. I think beyond the Enlightenment, or it gets included, but we're now at a particular juncture in the later development of it. Whereas my colleague on the faculty here at the time, Chris Kaiser, one of the smartest men I've ever known, he would have said about the postmodern conversation, it's not really post-modernity, it is hyper-modernity. And there are good reasons to see the continuities of those things. But all of that lies in a stratosphere, and I've appreciated some folks along the way that give it sort of people texture. Let me tell you about George Hunter. He's a Methodist He had been an evangelist and taught evangelism in some of the Methodist schools around the country for many, many years. He was the one who in 1973 founded the Academy for Evangelism in Theological Education. An awesome kind of topic, but a community that I had become involved in the late 80s and into the 90s and got to know George as well. He published a book in that time called How to Reach Secular People. And just think of the people. A lot of the conversations can fly in a stratosphere of generalized thinking without landing on somebody's ground. George Hunter had been studying the people he had come to know in our secular society for decades by 1992 when he published that book. In fact, he says his work grew out of probably around 11,000 interviews with specific people. In his younger days, he hung out at Muscle Beach, Santa Monica in California. And he, like others, were realtors, bodybuilders, and so forth. And it's those kinds of folks that he talked with and interviewed, a sense of what they felt, thought, and so forth. And he, in his book, gave a list of 10 things, a profile of secular people. Here are a couple of them, because I think several of these raise serious questions about some of the dynamics of gospel telling in American church life and evangelistic life. They are life-oriented, not death-oriented. And let's say to the track, like I received recently from a local church, says, "Are you sure you're going to heaven when you die?" Or the Presbyterian effort at evangelism explosion. Is that a non sequitur? Anyway, Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church in Fort Lauderdale was a very large Presbyterian church, and they had majored in an evangelistic approach, and they developed a telling of the gospel. It was just like all of these others, and it started with the question: if you were to die tonight, would God let you into his heaven? I've put several of their questions together in a mingled form there, but it is the starting point for a lot of American evangelists, frankly, in the last 75 years that I'm aware of. Now, in the next one, there's something even more telling. They are characterized by doubt about basic Christianity and other religions as well. A shift, therefore, from primary concern over guilt. A lot of our evangelism has majored in presuming that the people we speak to will quickly be self-aware of their own guilt about a lot of things they have thought, done, or said, and with a sense there is accountability somewhere down the line. He said the shift has happened, and we're not into an atmosphere where guilt is to be presumed, but doubt. They have a decreased sense of need for Christianity. They wonder if it is true, if it is relevant, if it makes a difference. Now, another one down his list is this: they fear history and dread the future. They feel it to be out of control. And they acknowledge even they themselves feel out of control. Well, these are some of the features that I remember reading in Hunter's book in the early 90s. And there was an occasion in which we were in the same room. It was a meeting of the Academy for Evangelism. And I was reviewing some of the recent literature, including his book. And I gave them a list of the things he had said are characteristics of secular people. And I asked them this question: which of those do you think is most true of people in your church? He sat up in his chair, staring. I was doing something to his questions. He was, I was suggesting to the folks gathered that when and people could quickly come up with a sense of which one is true. When we talk about people in our own church being like this, we are secular people, is what we're acknowledging. If it is true of the population in general, it is true of us. And actually, in his book, he does make a comment to that effect. He's mostly thinking about secular people as audience. What if secular people that are nonetheless believers and trying to navigate that relationship? I'll turn it over to Esther.
Mr. Moderator, can you repeat the question?
How would you describe the present age, and how would you approach ministry in this present age?
Did any grow up Baptist? Oh, good number, good showing. Okay, I'm gonna say something. Know that I have a strong affinity to the Baptists. Everyone, all the faculty here, I already know that. When I was a little girl, I would ask my dad. I was young and precocious and loved to talk theology from an early age. And so I'd ask my dad, what do they believe? You know, I noticed they're raising their hands in worship. He's, oh, that's what charismatics, we don't believe that. And then I would say, well, what about these people? They believe in, you know, infant baptism. He goes, yeah, we don't believe that. And then I asked him one day, putting these all together, Dad, what do Baptists believe? He goes, well, I don't really know so much as I know what we don't believe. I think he put it together over time, but I was thinking about that when I thought about the question, because sometimes we think in terms of post-enlightenment or post-Christendom. We're thinking a little bit, and you know, I think this was a little bit referenced, but we think about what was and what we are now, with a little bit of a reference towards the past, maybe some nostalgia, maybe some wishfulness. But I think, what if we could describe it in positive terms? And for me, what motivates a lot of my ministry engagement is thinking about an era of world Christianity that we all get to be a part of. And that kind of changes the conversation, because especially in a context like this, and maybe even less so in West Michigan, but in other places, you can feel the weight of loneliness, you know, the lack of hope, particularly, the feelings of maybe fear, you know, and being outnumbered. But when you kind of reframe that in terms of Christianity, when you pray with an African brother or sister, and you realize the kind of conviction and hope that motivates their faith, that inspires you, it kind of changes the conversation. And so in many ways, that's my motivation when I'm doing ministry, you know, in Zealand, is to connect them to a broader conversation of what is God doing in the world. And so I'll take groups on trips, and the question that carries us through the experience is, what is God doing here? And he's doing different things in different places, and opening their eyes to see, oh, I didn't realize this was, and the beauty of what God is doing in other places helps to kind of pull us out of our moment and to see a big God with many Christians around the world.
I'm watching the time, so I'm going to open it up for questions in a moment here. But I'll ask, you know, Paul, maybe I can ask you to answer this question specifically. Your latest book is titled Humble Confidence, and it relates to this idea of telling the gospel story in this present age. Just give us a brief, you know, synopsis of why is humble confidence important when it comes to telling the gospel story in this present age?
Yeah. Lots of things I could say. I mean, Nguyen defined evangelism as telling the story of Jesus. Okay? Telling the story of Jesus. And I've kind of developed that in different ways. I think that is, we live in a story-based culture. Yeah. I think what New Beginners helped me to understand that evangelism is not this idea that arises out of the Enlightenment, that somehow we have conquered the Christian message. We know what it is, it's ours. And therefore, we are part of the sacred. And if we're going to meet the secular, we have to invite them over to our territory. We have to say, in effect, you're wrong, but come over to us because we've got the answers. Okay? And that's a kind of possessive view of the gospel, which is so anti-gospel, actually. None of us possesses the gospel. But assuming we can sum it up in 4 pregnant phrases or points or steps, we think we have conquered it. Okay? And what strikes me about some of that stuff is how un-Jesus-centered it can become. New Begin was much more into what I would describe, following people like Andrew Walls, a pilgrim view of evangelism. In other words, evangelism is not inviting people over to where you sit or stand. It's going with that other person to a place that neither of you have actually arrived at yet. So witnesses bearing witness to something which is beyond yourself, okay, and to which you also are traveling. I find that one of the most exciting things to do. So with my students, I can talk to people on the streets. I say to my students, don't talk to them, don't talk at them, just ask them good questions. Ask them good questions. Do you ever pray? We found over 20 years, about 70% of people say yes. And these are not students, they haven't got up yet by the time we get it out on the streets. Okay, so who do you pray to? Oh, wow. That's a much more difficult question. A lot of people now say their grandparents. One person said to us, you know, it's easier to talk to them now they're not here. That's prayer, right? So then you're into what I would call the soft middle between faith and unbelief, between the sacred and the secular. And that space is not a difficult space to open up nowadays in our context, among the under 60s, I would say. But I think that the thing which I think is the real skill, and it relates to what we've been saying, is that I think the logic of New Begin stuff, which I talk about a lot in the book, is to immerse ourselves in the story of Jesus. That's the story we're wanting to pass on, and hold that in one's imagination as you are listening to another story being told to you. Okay? I pray, because I don't think it's a two-way conversation. I always say to my students, it's a three-way conversation. It's just not just you talking to somebody else, it's you alongside Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit, the Trinity, however you want to express that, talking to another person. So I'm open, I'm leaning into the presence of God in those conversations. And I often think, which part of the story of Jesus relates to what we're talking about here? And if the opening comes up, I say, I'm interested in that because actually Jesus once said this, and leave it at that point. So I'm not dilly-dallying around the edge. I'm getting to the center quick, and that opens up a whole bunch of stuff, usually in my conversations. And the vocabulary that's used by people is actually often very confusing. One example, I went down to our local coffee shop, barista with disgustingly long hair. I mean, I was so jealous. Said to me, what do you do? And I said, I work at the priest factory up the road. And he said, oh, wow. So what are you doing here? I said, well, having coffee. And the rest of the class had gone into town. They're talking to people. What about? He said. I said, we're talking about faith. What? Christian faith? I said, yeah. He said, well, I'm an atheist. It's a waste of time for me. So I said to him, oh, so you believe that actually your existence can be defined precisely by what you can feel and touch. There's nothing more to it than that. He said, no, not at all. I think there's actually quite a lot of, he was a pluriverse guy. No, I believe there are other existences. I believe in the spiritual and so on. So I eyeballed him. I don't eyeball many people, but I eyeballed him. I said, so you're not really an atheist, are you? He said, what do you mean? Well, I said, on the logic of what you've been telling me, you're not an atheist. He said, oh my God, I tell everybody I'm an atheist. What am I? I said, I think you'll find you're an agnostic. He said, can you write that down? What's an agnostic? Well, I said, not agnostic is not sure there isn't a God, but you're not sure there is one either, but you're open to it. That's me. I said, you're not an atheist. OMG, he said. I need to sit down and think this whole thing out. So I've met very few genuine atheists. Anyway, we got talking. I was able to share something of Jesus Christ into that conversation. And it's not a kind of come over to my place because I'm confused about a whole bunch of stuff too, but I do know Jesus Christ. So I think evangelism is an imaginative pilgrimage. That's the way I would think of it. And therefore, when I'm given something to say to somebody, I'm being evangelized myself, right? So I'm excited. I need to move into new territory and go with other people. So discipleship for us in our context, because we're third generation non-believers now and non-churchgoers, it begins with 2, 3. It begins with discipleship. And church then becomes, in my view, a retrospective category. We become church, and then are surprised by being formed into church. We're not actually anymore taking people to something we know much about. Okay? It's so far gone. But that's I think one of the implications, just grounding it. So if vocabulary is confusing, evangelism is telling the story of Jesus. Just live in it and share from the inside out. You don't have to share everything. Just share the words of Jesus. And I can tell you story after story after story as to how powerful that can be.
Open it up for questions from any of you. Sawyer.
What do you think it is for a seminary to train pastors in evangelism?
As opposed to what?
Well, like, I would say, so sorry, to get more detail in my question. How important would it be to have either a class or a set of experiences or curriculum that's actually like organized and structured as to teach future pastors how to evangelize? Or should it more just be an implicit part of the class without structure?
The tricky part of the question to me is how to evangelize. I think what Paul has already suggested are some images to spread us out and to recognize something about telling a story that we have come to indwell or that has come to grab hold of us. One of Newbegin's phrases I've most taken in as my own form of confession. I have been laid hold by another, by him who was crucified and was raised from the dead. In other words, the whole gospel has to do with God using us, not with us getting information to convince someone else so much as telling a story that wraps in it a telling of the whole world's story from beginning to end. It's that breadth of the story that I think is important. But it would be important, I mean, that the academy I'm talking about would be people who teach evangelism in theological education institutions. And I taught evangelism in many different ways in missiology work and in sometimes particular expression of evangelism. It's not so much if you wrap yourselves around depth understanding of the story of Jesus, which isn't over, but that's the operative piece. Then I would think every course you're in has to do with that. It forms that, encourages it, holds your commitment to it, to a kind of joy that overflows in telling that story.
Nick, Esther, you wanna go? You can tell the story. Esther and I used to argue a lot about evangelism.
Yeah.
We were, go ahead.
Before, there was class that was designed around pressing for a commitment to faith and probably going beyond some of the things that you were saying.
I can share. Let me just flesh that a little bit because I was actually a small group leader where we had to go out and share the gospel 10 times, okay, throughout the semester. And for you to get full points, you have to at least, you have to introduce yourself, find out more about who they are, present the basics of the gospel. And then for you to get full 10 out of 10, you have to at least ask for a decision, or at least you have to ask for a decision, or at least ask them. Going back to your, I think your comment, George, if you were to die tonight, do you think you'll go to heaven? And as a small group leader, I was told if they don't ask that question, you're supposed to knock off a point. Okay? I'm sorry, Suzanne's looking at me like I've got three heads. So Esther was in that class as well, and we would argue back and forth about whether or not that is, yeah. She was not in my small group.
Small group leader, and I refused to do it. So I instead chose to call relatives and have faith conversations with them. Relatives that I don't usually spend a lot of time talking to, but gave me space to ask them, questions about faith. And, what do you think heaven will be? Things like that. And just kind of move things further in a conversation that otherwise they would avoid. But yeah, we did get in some fights about that. And my small group leader definitely was frustrated with me, and I didn't care if I got marked down points, in part because the college that I'd gone to, I had seen this play out in spaces where you kind of are like a hitman on the street, where you're trying to go approach someone, and it didn't feel good. And the results didn't feel good. And so I was looking for something that was different. That being the case, I think that some of us who've had that experience with evangelism, the route we take is to just avoid it. And our job is to focus on retention of saints, if you will, and hope to kind of create a loving community that people just want to be a part of. And I think that there's more to it than that. And so I would tend to think of evangelistic skills the way that Paul's describing them, much like pastoral care skills, and would kind of fall under that category of, I think it probably does need some focus. But I'm not making any suggestions as the wife of the seminary president.
But let me add an illustration here at the seminary. In the days I was teaching, I taught a course in evangelism. That's what we called it. I think it was called telling the gospel or something. Because I had many of those experiences that Esther was reporting, where I was trained in those other methods and felt odd and icky about them. And now I have theological words to put even further. But in this course, the action assignment that I made was twofold. One was to interview 10 people who became a follower of Jesus in their conscious adult life and interview them.
Yep.
How did that come about? What took place? What brought you along to that faith? And then I said, a second set of interviews, I want you to conduct 6 of them. I was being a little lesser intensive because this is a harder one. Have 6 conversations and report them, exploring with somebody who is consciously not a Christian. Doesn't mean you've made the decision their claim to be a Christian isn't real. And you get rid of all that stuff that we get messed up with. And so that provided another set of things, both interviewing them along the lines of what is their life meaning and how do they ground that, where is it from, where does it lead, or inviting them to serve, to suggest reasons why a Christian option, if they've known anything about it, is not something they've chosen. I was amazed, especially because now I've had, in my reading of those reports, it was 10 each by 14 people, 140 conversations of how people came to faith in Jesus in their conscious adult life. And then 6 times 14 people who are consciously not Christians reporting kind of where they are and how we can get to know where they are. one of the remarkable things that struck me was the overall theme of the answers to that first question of conscious Christians. Thus, the church played a fundamental role in the bulk of them. That was what welcomed them, what acquainted them with this life of being a follower of Jesus and so on. On the other side of the ledger, those that consciously were not Christian, it was quite obvious the problem that hindered belief, or not experience of some church somewhere. Now that as a grounding sort of question to take with you in your education, you know, take that evangelistic set of ideas forward and wonder yourself, how does this play out?
Yeah, Dr. Weston, you mentioned Charles Taylor, and I like his work and Andrew Root's kind of work building off him, faith formation, and just thinking about authenticity in this age. And I'm curious if any of you guys have thoughts on how authenticity plays into your thinking in sharing the gospel in this age.
Oh, golly. Well, authenticity and technique often don't go the way. We're taught a technique from somebody else. It tends to make a lot of people inauthentic. So I think that's one of the fundamental issues. I mean, I think putting in a wider frame, I think the disciplinary nature of theological education, which is a modernist construct, divides Christianity up in a whole bunch of little pockets, right? And I think we need to keep returning to the center of a whole thing, which is we believe in a God who is defined as love. So everything we do, everything we study is the result of the overflowing love of God towards us, expressed most fully in Jesus Christ. And if you start there and you think, well, what would I want to teach my students? You come to some pretty interesting conclusions, I think. We ask, how does the New Testament relate to that vision of God in our doctrine? Explore that more in our whatever. And then we think, well, would we add evangelism to that? And you think, oh, what a stupid question. Yeah, if evangelism is telling people the good news or sharing the good news, what is the good news? It is that God is love. But to your question, it is all about authenticity. In other words, if you take Polanyi's definition of what we know, it is that to which we are personally committed, that which changes us, that which fires us, that which motivates us. It's all about motivation. What do we love? What do we really love? Okay, and that's a great question for us here today, right? At seminary, one of the questions that the Anglican Church in its godly wisdom asked its students or its tutors to fill in was, to what extent does your student love God more at the end of this year than they did at the beginning? Right? And when that question was read out in our faculty, we all burst into laughter. Sorry, naughty. They did. I mean, how would you know? Is that about chapel attendance? About this or whatever? But you and I know that we see and recognize authenticity when we see it and meet it. So whatever it is that we're studying, whatever you've studied already today, if that is not making its way into your mind, soul, heart, and body, it's inauthentic. It's inauthentic. And that will show. Okay. So I think that's one of the key aspects in the whole business of witness. You know, how is it that Christ, by the Holy Spirit, is causing and calling me to be a witness? And what does that look like for me? And we need to be authentic about that at all different levels. So I think it's in that kind of relationship. I think Newbigin would take that further and say, you know, this great phrase about the congregation being the hermeneutic of the gospel. And I've seen that in actions. That's basically about a community which is so grounded in the love, the overflowing love of God, that it's authentic in its relationships and so on. And that crosses theological disciplinary boundaries, left, right, center, right? And that's what draws people. See in you something that makes me want to question my own life. So I think a lot of what Taylor is talking about is really helpful actually in relation to that. He's also, I think, very helpful in relation to story. And he's also, I think, really uncompromising about the impact of modernity. Still, the dark side of modernity, the buffered selves that we live, which bleed, he says, and they do. And as pastors, we need to be conscious of that and be there with people when they bleed. And I can give lots of examples, a lot of examples yourselves. Yeah. Does that kind of get somewhere towards it?
Yeah.
We have just a few minutes left, and so Jason and then Abby. Why don't you both say your questions and then we'll try to wrap it up in 3 minutes.
Start.
Go ahead, Abby.
How does this idea of mythology fit into what we consider like traditional missions, or should it? The like idea of a missionary does a bunch of fundraising and then goes overseas. Can this like idea fit into that system, or do we need to rethink our idea of missiology as a church?
And then Jason.
So I'm a mental health counseling student, so I've been thinking about like emotions and systems. And my question is, if we grew up or learned that kind of system of I need to go save people or I need to go convince people, and we're moving towards kind of more journeying alongside people, how do we make that shift, not just cognitively, but how do we retrain our bodies and our emotions so that we can enter evangelism in that way?
Great. So I'm thinking, Esther, can I ask you to answer the mission question? This question on mission, and then Paul and George, you want to do a coin toss here by Jason's question? George got it. George nodding. Okay.
Thank you for your question, Abby. Yeah, it's complicated. So all of us would be considered missiologists, with, PhDs in it, and all of us are familiar with that world. It's funny how much that world doesn't always talk to the missiologist world. That's one of the downside. I mean, there's so many different guilds, the American EMS, Evangelical Missiological Society, American Society of Missiology, and every year they publish papers and they have journals and so forth. And they struggle to get anyone who does, mission involved, and they've been invited, but there is a disconnect there. And oftentimes, as is the case when you get money involved, and you get kind of going in a groove, this is our operation, this is what we do, you don't stop to reflect and go, hey, wait, are we doing this the best way? Have we really thought through why we're doing this? And, and I think that's the challenge. So for me, after doing a PhD and being in academia, for such a long time, to switch and go to the church and go, oh, wow, okay, these conversations are happening in very different spaces. I think that's the first piece, is there needs to be a lot more talking to each other, So
I could just add to that. In our context, I think one of the things Theonugraha does is to say missiology is not what we do to somebody else. It's not out there. He was one of the first, if not the first, to say Western Europe, Northern America is itself a mission field, and that requires that sense of analysis and cultural insight. I think for us in Poole, where we are now, new context, it's the real question is to answer Newbegin's question, which is an absolute humdinger, I think. How would you Christologically read your local community? Whoa. You're going to be cross-disciplinary on that, but that is such a great question. What does it mean to say we need to be incarnation? What does that mean in my part of the world, etc., etc.? And therefore, discerning what God is saying in our locality, for my money, is the center of what missiology is about. It's to be the people who are the overflow of God's love for this place where you are. And that's really important. I think that would keep the theological curriculum going for a very long time.
I apologize, Jason. I think I got your name, but Didn't catch fully the nuance of your question. How do we?
Yeah, so it kind of raised in an environment where we had that model, that first model of evangelism, where we're kind of going out and trying to bring people onto our side. How do we emotionally retrain ourselves to kind of view evangelism more as journeying alongside someone? So maybe we've already made the cognitive shift, but like how do we emotionally shift in that way?
I think to pose the question, I take to be your own self-invitation to take that journey. And it's a long journey. I was reared even in a seminary course, in a seminary, not to be named, in the Deep South, where our evangelism training was to go to Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church and go out and visit people and do this and say this. And even the associate pastor there, that was the one that I went out with, he didn't like the program at all as well. So that kind of thing. But to come across the responses, if we're acting out of some mode of existence we think is appropriate, we've been trained to think this way and do this. When you are in those situations, learn from them, even if you're not actively inquiring, as Paul is suggesting. Start by noting your own reactions to what's happening in conversation and develop for yourself a kind of grounding. How do we do that? I think the classic answers would be to continue to read and reread the story of Jesus, not just in the Gospels, but in the rest of the New Testament, and reckon with the large, vast dynamic of the purposes of God, which were established in Jesus' death and resurrection, and live with that. Pray in those terms. Discover the ways that you can be helped for a new stance, a new outlook, a new way of engaging. I say that, let me add this one thing that I think is a fascinating question. I sort of threw this in another answer earlier to say, Jesus isn't finished yet. I think we live with a 2,000-year gap in things, leave us wondering, is all of this just an ancient historical story? And why should life be wrapped in a commitment to that story? I like what Esther said earlier about her congregation and raising the question, what is God doing now? And in particular, what is Jesus doing now? My image is Jesus is sitting, right, at the right hand of God. Obviously, it's a position of power. He's been given the scroll, Revelation 5. But is that what Jesus is doing? We're waiting and waiting 2,000 years for something more we thought was to come because there were promises that it would. And is Jesus just like us waiting to show up again at the end? I don't believe that. And one clue I find in Acts 7, Stephen, the deacon, had been engaging people of his own ethnic background in a particular synagogue in Jerusalem, and he's retelling the story from the Old Testament on up to this point. That's part of the clue. The story of Jesus has its antecedents in the Old Testament, and it can only be understood in light of those. But it goes on from there. So here's Stephen, and the crowd is getting more and more irate. Paul is in the shadows, holding the cloaks of people who are about to take action, and they do. They're stoning him to death. Stephen. Luke says this twice. He says, Stephen saw Jesus standing at the right hand of God. This is not an inactive, twiddling my thumbs, waiting posture for Jesus. We might want to imagine how often that happens. I said Luke says it twice because he says that happened. And then he says, and Stephen said to the crowd, I see Jesus standing at the right hand of God. which probably just increases the flow of stones. But where are the clues about how we do see Jesus active and doing things in our time? What is Jesus doing today that you have observed? One of those things is in Matthew 25, where Jesus said, giving a drink of cold water, feeding, clothing, visiting, the least of them. When you have done that, you have done it unto me. I am showing up in your world there with the poor, the despised, the vulnerable. Where is Jesus?
Amen. Thank you. Thank you, George. Thank you for that good word. Friends, you join me in thanking our guests here for this afternoon.
Thank you, thank you. I just have a couple of announcements. I feel weird standing right where I'm standing, so I'm going to move over here. Okay, so Dr. Weston, Felix mentioned his book, which is called Humble Confidence. There are some copies of it out there if you want to go look at them. And also, Dr. Weston's going to be at Faith Church in Zealand on Thursday night at 7 o'clock. And the title of his talk there is going to be Mission 101, Developing a Missionary Spirituality in Our Personal Lives. So you're invited to attend that, I think, right? Yeah, okay. Good. And then our next PTL is a week from tomorrow, so next week, Tuesday. And you might not see so much of this happening because a lot of it's happening off campus. But next week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Dr. Billings and I in the Gerard Chair are going to be hosting what's called the Faith and Illness Initiative. Which has to do with Dr. Billings' own research on chronic illness and Christian vocation. And so there are going to be some people, some pastors and theologians and medical professionals, and a few students that are going to be a part of that conversation. It's largely happening off campus. But on Tuesday, next Tuesday for PTL, one of the guests, who is Dr. Kate Sonderegger, is going to come and join us as a guest. She's super cool. And you want to know her. She's a systematic theologian. And so I'm going to open up the sign up for that after I shut down this Zoom on my computer. And you want to be there next week, Tuesday, all right, for Dr. Sonderegger. Okay. Oh, and my final announcement is if you have a plate that is not paper, it needs to go in the dishwasher. There is a dishwasher in the corner over there. I don't want to put your plate in the dishwasher. So please put your plate in the dishwasher. And the napkins, I actually don't know what happens to the napkins. Does anybody? Do you know?
No.
Okay,
A pile there or hand them to.
great. Drew will grab the cloth napkins if you leave them on the table over there. Thank you.